Buongiorno a tutti, benvenuti al nostro secondo incontro. Assalamu alaikum, rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome again to our web series, Dialogues on Innovation, the Pandemic, Human Civilization, and the Limits of Technology. It's a cycle organized with the Embassy of Italy to the UAE and with the kind collaboration of the other Italian diplomatic missions in the Gulf area. This is our second meeting entitled Man, Survival versus Wellbeing. Before giving the floor to our guest speakers today, let me sum up the general point of our initiative in a few words. Our starting point is empirical. During the pandemic, we became even more conscious of the deep and all-pervading presence of technology in our lives. And we noticed that this ubiquity makes it an extremely powerful tool in promoting changes for better and for worse. In times of pandemic, technology is giving us an extraordinary help. It is definitely a strong social as well as economic support, but it could also mean alienation, estrangement, even surrender. And this double phase has a significant impact on culture. Creating culture and enjoying culture is inseparable from a fully human existence, which means associated life, active and direct participation in the community, with the involvement of all the senses we are endowed with, thanks be to God. Our ancestors, the ancient Romans, had very clear such concepts when they spoke, for example, of humanitas from human, or civilitas from civitas or city. The fully human dimension of culture, fully sensorial, is also found in the Arabic language, the language of this beautiful and hospitable country where we are staying. Just consider, for example, thaqafa, the Arabic word for culture, which comes from the verb thaqafa, meaning at the same time to become skillful, intelligent, sharp, quick, but it could also be said of vinegar, meaning that it is very sour, that it has a very acidic taste. We could also recall adab, the Arabic word for literature, which means, first of all, conviviality, taking part in a banquet, eating together. In these webinars, our aim is not at all arguing against technology, but discussing an excessive reliance on it at the expense of our nature of full and complete human beings. The issues we want to raise, thanks to the contribution of our guest speakers, are to what extent the technologies adopted during the emergency phase can remain in a context of normality, and how much humanity are we giving up? It seems important to discuss these points in this very country, which follows a model of sociality founded on direct and personal contacts, so similar to the Italian and Mediterranean model. Last week, we talked about language. We began this series with language because it is the expression of our logos, the rational discourse, the human cultural activity par excellence, and also because of its peculiar relationship with technology, given that, on the one hand, language escapes it, and on the other hand, it is its backbone. Our guest speakers emphasized that also language suffered a real shock during the pandemic. It got somehow sick, for example, undergoing linguistic taboos, but it reacted, putting into play the antibody of neologisms, of metaphor, and above all of irony, from covidiots to tricini to the brand new covidence, suggested by one of our guests, a middle way between COVID, evidence, and providence. Today, we will focus on the adaptability of the human being. During the pandemic, we had to change our habits to survive. So the questions are, how far can we change? And how far can adaptation be pushed in a relatively short time? And then, will it be possible to go back? We have here with us today Professor Telmo Pievani, Dr. Mariam Ketait, and Professor Fabio. Telmo Pievani is a distinguished evolutionist, professor at the University of Padua, where he covers the first Italian chair of philosophy of biological sciences. Professor Pievani, we look forward to hearing your comments on today's topic. Please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ida, and good evening to everybody. And thanks so much to you, Ida, for this invitation and for this presentation as well. So I'm very grateful for this occasion. So you said I'm a philosopher of science and an expert in biology and an evolutionist. So I will try to answer to your very challenging questions from an evolutionary perspective, very briefly. And I think that the point lies in the relationships between biological evolution, our biological evolution, and our cultural evolution. I'll try to introduce just a couple of evolutionary models that we use today in order to disentangle this very complicated matter. Firstly, as you said, we invented technologies, and these have filled in some way our ecological niches, right? And our babies, for example, have become native from time to time with new technologies. Therefore, technologies and culture have contributed to shape, literally shape their brains differently. So the eco-cultural niches, so modified, fed back recreatively on human populations, modifying them on the social, cognitive, and even at the genetic level. So in short, we think in evolution that the genus Homo, our genus, evolved in a kind of symbiosis with its technologies. For example, we have recently discovered interactions between cultural evolution and genetic evolution. The expansion of Middle Eastern farmers, for example, towards Europe began around, we know now 9,000 years ago or so on. Together, grain cultivation and the domestication of animals obviously arrived in Europe. That is, both humans with unprecedented behaviors and new technologies arrived in a new territory. So the European ecological niche changed because many animals that produce meat and milk and in interaction with humans were now around. So today, molecular biologists recently discovered that around 7,500 years ago, perhaps in Northern or Central Europe, a genetic mutation spread in some groups of shepherds and farmers, which delayed the shutdown of the lactase enzyme used by babies to break down and digest milk. So the mutation allowed carriers to digest fresh milk even in the adult and offering so a great adaptive advantage. So in this very simple example, what happened exactly in evolutionary terms? It happened that in some way you have a cultural and technological change, that is breeding animals, but we can have many other examples, that modified the human ecological niche, altering the selective pressures that act on the human groups of the time, favoring the success of certain genetic mutation rather than others. So technology came first, then genetics. Culture came first, then biology. It seems evolution upside down. And the phenomenon repeated elsewhere in West Africa, for example, in the Arabian Peninsula as well, with similar effects. So cultural changes can feed back on our biology and modify our genome. So now we could generalize this example. In my field, we have a very recent model. We call it niche construction. And it's a general term for the co-evolutionary pattern in which organisms don't just respond to selective pressures imposed by the environment, but also they actively contribute to modify the environment itself, therefore modifying the frame of selective pressure acting on them. And, you know, we as Homo sapiens, we are the champion of the world of this process of niche construction, of niche modification. But we have to add that niche construction could be, as you said, an ambivalent process. Ambivalent because it's given us great evolutionary success and prosperity and economic, social success, and so on, even if not for everyone anyway. But this process can turn into something like an evolutionary trap, we call evolutionary trap. If the environment, for example, is altered too quickly and too dramatically. For example, some very known human technological activities or human activities related to technologies, for example, deforestation, invasive species, agricultural and industrial pollution, overpopulation, intensive fishing and so on, are causing today what we call the sixth mass extinction of biodiversity. That is as serious as the major catastrophes in the paleontological past, in the paleontological record. So the depletion of ecosystems guaranteed immediate profits to a predatory market, but will present us with a very expensive bill when we have to pay for example, the ecosystem services that we receive for free today from biodiversity and from the environment: water cycle, air cleaning, soil fertility, pollination by insects, and so on. So another very brief example: what is climate change if not a global and quite risky niche construction process? Technologically, we bring fossil fuels to the surface of the earth, we refine them, we burn them. So in other words, climate change, from my point of view, on evolutionary scale, is a global niche construction process in which a single species, for the first time, is able to alter the ecological parameters of the earth, biochemical cycles of the biosphere, by obliging the other species to adapt in the short term. However, we have also to add that this process creates the fact that we have also to adapt to the world that we have changed. So it's something like a recursive process. We change the world for our success, but then we have to adapt to a changed world to ensure that we have changed. And this could be very successful, but could be also ambivalent and could be also dangerous. COVID-19 pandemic is another example of environmental cost, since we know that spillover of viruses is favored, is promoted by the degradation of ecosystems, by the illegal trade of animals, and so on. So we have something like a negative feedback from the environment. So you pose the question, how far can we change? I would say that if the 19th, 20th century technologies are at the origin of most of the above problems, I think that the damages are not inherent to the technologies itself, but to its uses. So technology is, and for me, will be an essential part of the solutions, thanks to innovation, energy efficiency, vaccines, as well as we know today, and all these eco-sustainable alternatives that will be able to produce, and that the humans of the future will be able to produce. And those humans of the future, the next generation, will be, we have to consider that, they will be climate change natives. They will be natives of all our ecological changes. So niche construction process also explain particularly well the phenomenon of being native to a technology, okay? Because the human brain, it's always the same, but growing in a new technological, eco-technological landscape is like being born in a different environment that redefines our relationships with reality. Thus, we can hope that climate change natives will find solutions that we, as climate change immigrants, cannot even imagine. So who could have imagined, for example, the serendipitous discovery of the World Wide Web or the gene editing 20 years ago or 30 years ago? Now, who can predict what we'll do with these biotechnologies and new technologies in 10 years in the future? So my conclusion in the second model for me is, I think that there is a technical reason for being optimistic and for this unpredictability and serendipity of human ingenuity. And the technical reason is this one: technological innovation never starts from nothing, but from existing technologies that are recombined and hybridized, so reorganizing them through new design and new usages. So this evolutionary tinkering, as we call it, like a bricolage, is the basis of both biological evolution and human techno-evolution. That's very interesting. We call it exaptation. That means functional shifts. And this is my favorite model, because in the history of technologies, it's very rare that you can find an invention that maintained the same functions originally envisaged and produced by its creator. Every technology, when it's born, enters into an ecology of other already existing technologies, and unpredictably changes the pattern of relationships among them. So finally, our brain itself, we can think about it, is a compendium of exaptations, because our neural components, more or less ancient in our brain, were born in relation to certain survival ancestral functions, completely different with respect to the use that we have today for the same parts. So what is amazing for me is that with a brain born in 200,000 years ago in Africa, but unusually plastic, today we can learn to read and write that surely are not function related to the origin of our brain. So we are able to produce technologies and to carry out tasks for which certainly our brains have not evolved before. So that's amazing, because the same large bipedal mammal with the same brain size that 100,000 years ago scrambled with sticks and chipped stones, today drives a spaceship and builds robots that explore Mars surface and invents nanotechnological wonders like graphene and so on. So 100,000 years seems a lot, but actually, from my point of view as an evolutionist, it's a very little time. It's little more than 4,000 human generations. So this is exactly why I think that we can say that human evolution is only in its infancy, it's only in its beginning. So at the end, I'm optimist despite the fact that the ambivalent progress of human technologies.
Thank you very much, Telmo Pievani, for your contribution, so full of information and inputs. I was struck by what Paolo Giordano, a well-known Italian author, wrote recently in his book Nel Contagio, translated into English as How Contagion Works, and then recently into Arabic, thanks, I say, thanks to the intermediation of this institute, with the title Fil Adwa. I quote from this book: "No one likes being left out, and the knowledge that our separation from the world is only temporary doesn't do much to ease the suffering. We have a desperate need to be with others, among others, under 3 feet away from people who mean something to us. It feels as vital to us as breathing." Now, on these words, I leave the floor to Mariam Ketait, family doctor, well-being designer, expert at the Prime Minister's Office. The physical participation of the human being in a shared space is among your main research interests. In fact, you are co-founder and CEO of Ebb and Flow, design spaces for people to access well-being through furniture and space curation. So please, Dr. Ketait.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ida. And thank you, Professor Pievani, for the optimism. It was so beautiful to see that, you know, we're on the right track. I mean, we are adaptive by nature. And I think with everything that's going on around us, I mean, I started the year by designing a chair called Al-Mahabba, which translates to love, but sharing love between two individuals. And it helps people sort of connect on a heart-to-heart level. And the whole aim behind it was to let technology go for a minute and just sit and connect person to person, which was interesting to see how we ultimately needed to connect through our Zoom boxes this year. But more importantly, we needed to reflect inwards. I think when you talk about isolation, Dr. Ida, and how people might feel isolated, we have an interesting demographic here in the UAE. We have a huge number of people who are living without their families. We also have people who came in with their families, but still maybe they are disconnected from their bigger families and their lands. So everyone experienced isolation in a different way. And we kind of went through the adaptation process from, you know, just isolating ourselves completely and then finding solutions. As we mentioned earlier, you know, human nature tends to kind of find solutions, which is great. And from there rose a different type of humanitarian connection. So a lot of people started creating solutions for others, holding circles, support circles. Here in the UAE, we had mental well-being hotlines and a well-being academy that was launched. And there are so many, all the private sector psychologists came into play. So mental health awareness also started rising, which is great all around the world. And you saw people from experts in their fields from all around the world come together and share knowledge. And that kind of brought in much more optimism into the new way of coexisting or co-creating. I like to call it co-creating, because maybe we used to coexist on Earth and we created all that whatever it is that we created that led up to this. But if we think of it as us co-creating with our partners, with nature, with all the elements that come into play, then it's more of a creative process that is generative rather than consumeristic. And that's something that I think we're all also re-examining. So with COVID, a lot of people had to re-examine what they value in life, you know, whether it is the way they used to consume even travel, you know, our carbon print, how we distract ourselves from what really matters, and started to shift their focus inwards on the things that are really of value. So intimate relationships, family values, friendships, even going out for a walk on the beach, you know, we took so for granted. It's all of a sudden, it became something that we cherish. You know, we're so happy that we get to experience nature, even if it's little bits of time, we get to experience breath. So I'm really grateful to see that also, that maybe with us going on the rat race, as humanity started to become more industrial and technological, we somehow lost focus on the human element and what really matters to our well-being. And now maybe we had the opportunity to shift our focus and reflect inwards and say, you know what, this works for me, this makes me feel better, and I'm gonna spend more time and give it more energy, you know, whether it is taking care of your health or your sleep or your food or your family or things that back to basics, you know. And from there, I think moving forward, having all that, there's an information overload with social media, with all the information that's out there. So with technology and evolution of that paradigm comes also the importance of increasing mental resilience, so that you know what to choose, what to invite into your life. You know, you have to be very selective. There emerges an importance for governments and for governance of data, you know, the privacy situation. So there's so many different issues that we're dealing with, and we're learning how to coexist or co-create with, and finding our balance. I think I'm also optimistic. I would share that with all the changes happening, because the new generation are much more aware. So of course, with information, there's a lot of awareness. And with the pandemic, a lot of people had access to information because of everything that's available on the internet, whether it's academically or socially, or also the support circles that I was talking about. So for example, Dubai Cares had an initiative where they made sure that education continued for those less privileged who were not able to continue education. So a lot of people found bridges to help and support each other. And to me, when people start connecting in that way and they start co-creating, it's worth being optimistic. And yeah, so that's it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mariam. Thank you for your deep and, I would say, wise words. And now I am very, very glad to give the floor to a prominent biologist, internationally renowned, Fabio Piano, professor at the New York University, founder, director of the Center for Genomics and Systems Biology at NYU. Here in the UAE, he really needs no introduction, because he's the one who brought NYU to Abu Dhabi, and the one who brilliantly set the university's academic strategy. And being provost for 10 years, he brought this institution up to its current outstanding level. So please, Fabio Piano, I leave the floor to you.
Well, with that introduction, I better not say anything. I should just leave it like that. It's so beautiful. Thank you so much, and wonderful to be part of this panel. I just want to thank you, Dr. Ida Zilio-Grandi, and I think you're the inaugural director of the Italian Cultural Institute, and therefore it's the same for you. So I'm really looking forward to how that develops. And I want to sort of express also my real gratitude for the other panelists who have really said some really interesting things that I think really relate to a big, big question. And for the people that are listening to us, we're adapting with technology as we speak. It's dinner time in various parts of the world. I hope you're enjoying it if you are eating, but I also want to thank you for participating in this conversation. One of the things that this technology does is allows me to be at home to tell you what's going on. And so this is an interesting moment where we are, maybe instead of going out, we're letting the world in. And in some ways, it's one of those things that we do get to adjust to. I want to sort of maybe touch upon a couple of points. I want to start because this is a big topic, as you heard already. And I think already you sort of heard what I think is a really good frame at the very evolutionary sense of what happens, you know, in thinking about how humans continuously adapt over time and evolve over time. And I think you also heard the spirit, the issue of our well-being, and very, very much on the micro level and how we do the living that we do. And so I want to sort of focus maybe somewhere in the middle. And I'm going to sort of start with sort of a neurobiology kind of metaphor that can be taken, as you heard before, even further, which is to think about how our brain is really structured. And so the premise of this topic is really one in which, you know, is this good or bad? Are we going to come out of this well, or what's going to happen? And you heard, I think, what I believe I agree with, our optimistic outlooks. But our brain is actually essentially designed to recognize patterns and exquisitely designed to recognize changes in those patterns. So for example, if you look at an image that is static, but in that image there is a very well mimicked organism, As soon as it moves, you see it. In fact, it's so exquisitely checking for changes in the pattern that you can have a static image that has absolutely no change, and you can trick the brain that is actually moving. So we are really wired to look at change and actually to worry about change. But there's another part of our nervous system, which is in fact what is called habituation. As the signals continue to come from the same source, our nervous system dampens them because they actually become normal. So the question about what becomes normal is in fact the same. So for example, unless I'm conscious about it, I don't feel the shirt on my back. But if a little bug starts walking a tiny little ant on my back, I will feel it immediately. So there is in fact that kind of nervous system that is adapting all the time to our surroundings. And it's doing this balance. It's saying what is new that potentially is dangerous, and our approach, I think, to such changes are kind of with suspicion, or totally habituation allows us to say, okay, this is fine. We're going to embrace it and we're going to move forward. So I use this as a metaphor to maybe talk about 3 topics if I get quickly through them. One is I cannot, of course, not talk a little bit about the pandemic. The second, I'll talk a little bit about education. I also cannot not talk about that. And then I want to end on this topic of wellness because it's really close to my heart. And I should say, like you heard from the other speakers, that also my training actually is in evolution. But I do think that one of the things that we've seen in the pandemics, and this particular pandemic, is a kind of surprise that has been called unprecedented in our generation. And of course, we all know that it's really not that unprecedented, certainly in the history of humanity, and certainly in some parts of the world, epidemics are not new at all, if we haven't experienced them ourselves. So there is something about this that I think speaks to how we react to this mega change. This is a big, we would call it an insult actually in biology, that is happening to our environment. And in some ways we have to react to it. So I think that one of the things that we should recognize is that we should not worry about this ending as much as we do. We should not worry about when is this over and when can we go back to exactly the way things were before. This is a very common approach that we always have, but in fact, we should think about moving forward. And, depending on the kinds of models that you see, in some capacity, we've already moved forward. So there are some countries that in fact have done beautiful, let's say, difficult lockdowns and have managed to move it forward in their economy, for example. And other countries, oddly enough, that know a lot about public health that have not done that and are now paying the price and continue to pay the price. But this is a global pandemic. The issue that is really interesting is that sometimes people respond, this is a criticism, this is demonstrating that globalization is a problem and it's upon us. The reality is globalization is the only solution to global problems. If you start to think about the kinds of problems that we've talked already, and we'll talk maybe a couple more minutes of climate change and the environment, we have one planet and one species. We've decided to separate ourselves in some capacity, but the reality is we have problems that are really serious, that are going to be global in nature, especially as we continue on this journey that we're on, that will require a global solution. And so this is a really great example of one, because as long as there's going to be the raging epidemic, even if we can solve it in one country, that country will not be able to be safe because the raging epidemic could come back in many different ways. And as you heard, mutation could happen as the virus actually continues to mutate itself over time, and if we don't stop it more quickly, it has more chance to mutate. Some of them are going to go, less virulent, but other times it could be unpredictable results. So it's a good idea to continue to think that we all want to make sure that this pandemic goes away, but to do it in a way that we're coordinating with each other. But I want to give a couple of maybe one sort of not so negative example of technology and how it has helped us already. And of course, there's many examples. Of course, vaccine development, the fact that within essentially a very, very short time, a total incredible record, we found out what the infectious agent was that was giving this pulmonary impact on these patients in China. And within really a time that, for HIV, it took 5 years. For this particular one, it took a few weeks, and we know the genetic code. Once we knew the genetic code was made available by the Chinese researchers to the whole world the same day, essentially. And the whole world could then design a testing regime that is absolutely effective in finding out if people have bits and pieces of the viruses within their systems. So technology has helped us in every possible way. Of course, how we use it is the important piece. But the thing I would like to sort of talk about is the fact that through this moment, and in fact, I'm particularly talking about Zoom and the fact that we're communicating, the fact that we are talking about the impersonality of it, which is absolutely to be talked about, but it has enabled a lot of other things to happen. We've continued to educate in some ways. I'll talk about that in a second. But in fact, we've continued to have progression of our economies and continue to operate as countries. And of course, the impact on these economies has been great. However, it has not been anywhere as bad as if we didn't, can you imagine, have this kind of technology available to be able to at least buffer some of these issues. And so I would argue that, in fact, one of the major things we're going to learn out of this which is how technology can give us some potential lessons, is we have had to work from home. Many of us who would normally not work from home, we've worked from home. That has absolutely affected our carbon footprint on the planet. And this carbon footprint, there was a paper came out in Nature in May that predicted what 2020 was going to look like compared to 2019. And depending on how the lockdowns would continue over the years, they predicted that we would be somewhere between 5 and 8% less carbon footprint than the previous year in the whole world. This is a huge number. And what that will do is give us a kind of a moral dilemma, because it'll tell us that we can operate at least in some capacity in a hybrid way to connect with each other. Perhaps not everything is going to be the same as before, but that will have the impact of not changing that environment as rapidly as we've been changing it, which might be actually something that society might want to sort of do. And so this is going to be a very interesting post-pandemic question that people will have to address. It'll also give data of the impact of our carbon footprint that is having on the climate itself, that we've never had the experiment before of actually lowering by this much the amount of carbon dioxide that is going into the atmosphere. So all of a sudden, these conversations about modeling will be a lot stronger than they've ever been, even if they don't need to really be, but I think we'll know something. And one of the conclusions of this paper, which I found very interesting, is that in some ways, this level of carbon footprint of this year would just return us to 2006. That gives you an amazing sense of how rapidly we continue to increase the carbon footprint over time. And we didn't return to 1970s or even 1800s, we returned to 2006. So this Paris Accord requirements are actually really hard. And so the question will become, how does innovation play a role to really reach those targets that have been put together? And I think that the post-pandemic conversation around countries is going to end up really developing this kind of conversation with data, which is really an important thing. I want to switch over to education because, of course, as you heard, as one of the things that is really dear to my heart, and a lot of us are educators, we really had to balance at the beginning, like a lot of people, what we thought was an incredibly important value system of continuing to educate the next generation of humanity versus making sure everyone is safe. And how do you balance these two incredibly important elements? So we did both as much and as well as one can, maximizing parameters to be able to maintain safety, but to continue education, perhaps in a way that we did not think was going to be as good as what we did before, but at least continue it. And I think there's an interesting lesson. I just wanted two seconds on NYU Abu Dhabi for those of you who may not know it. NYU Abu Dhabi is NYU. It just happens to be in Abu Dhabi. One of the things that made NYU Abu Dhabi really work is the fact that we're not a sort of an outside campus somewhere in another country. We give NYU degrees, we are NYU, and the whole university is behind it. And it was difficult and courageous. It was a big change for NYU to do this. But this country also asked for a very sort of forward-thinking American-style university to come to the UAE. And actually, we agreed on the basic premise of what this new university should do, because we had the chance to build one, which was to say, the world is changing, but those changes are, in some sense, affecting the change itself, meaning that it's the speed with which change is happening that is actually happening in front of our eyes. And the two major forces that is increasing that change are globalization and technology. And so if universities are honest and they're trying to produce a kind of cadre of incredible talented individuals coming out of universities, they have to say they're not really sure what kind of world these young people are going to inherit. And all you have to do is look at the major companies of the world and recognize they're so young and they're disrupting all of the previous operations of all the previous companies. And in fact, disruption is part of life. Globalization is part of life, which means that a basic tenet is our ability to actually go backwards, I would say, in the history of universities, which is to really develop an individual that has critical thinking skills and has the ability to always want to learn and take every single opportunity to increase their learning capacity. So that then change is not seen as fear, or meeting a person from another culture or from another religion or from another historical background is actually seen as an opportunity to confront your own ideas with someone who's different from you and try to figure out whether there's something that you should do with your ideas, or in fact you impact another person's idea, or as I would call it, connecting with a kind of a confident humility with another person. And I think that's a basic premise of this. But I thought perhaps in this context, just for 1 minute, to give you a sense of why technology has always been difficult in education and how we can sort of learn from the past. So I want to start from the Western tradition of universities all the way back to essentially something that Plato wrote and attributing to Socrates. He said that Socrates said the following about the fact that, as you may know, in the Greek academy, it was all about interaction with each other orally. And so the context was to really interact with your mind and words with each other, but orally. And so Socrates had said, anyone who leaves behind a written manual on the supposition that such writing provides something reliable and permanent must be exceedingly simple-minded. Written words seem to talk to you as though they are intelligent, but if you ask them anything about what they say from the desire to be instructed, they go on telling you exactly the same thing forever. So for him, the written word was taboo, no good. But then, of course, came the fact that as universities progressed, and this, of course, jumping way many evolution steps in the evolution of universities, but more towards the American invention of universities, taking the history mostly from a British 16th, 17th century type of history, leading actually people to debate whether universities are any good or useful, because people will exchange ideas and start to wonder whether important things written in some scriptures ought to be questioned. And so the governor of Virginia in around 1750s wrote, "Thank God there are no free schools," and by free here he means free thinking. But anyway, there are no free schools nor printing, and I hope we shall not have these for hundreds of years. For learning has brought disobedience and heresy into the world, and printing has divulged them. So this is how education was born in the United States in terms of our ability to actually debate ideas. This is why academic freedom has become such an important tenet of American style education. And this is also why in the American style system of educating, one of the most important things one can do as a faculty, as a scholar, is actually break a previous dogma. Discover something that actually says that what we have believed in all this time is wrong. That's the highest level of attainment, very different from many other cultures. I'll just end by saying that a very simple sentence by Einstein that said, "My pencil and I are smarter than I am." So he accepted that there's a tool that can help him. I'll end with a very simple example of what I think will end up being one of the outcomes of COVID-19. And that is that I believe that one of the great gifts of our generation in the area of science and biological science has been the actual decoding of the human genome. And this has been done in the early 2000s and has continued to operate in a way that you heard references to. And it's been extremely important and developing in life sciences and also in medicine in various very important ways. This has led to an initiative that Barack Obama, when he was president of the United States, labeled as precision medicine. This is leading us back to actually who we are as human beings. And that is that medicine, of course, always talks about the individual. However, a lot of times it's based on science that is based on disease and how to cure somebody. We have a great body of evidence that can help this. We have a much less strong body of evidence that can help wellness. And the scientific approach to wellness is just beginning. And I think there will be an enormous amount of new innovation and ability to get that going over the next few decades. And I think that, in fact, in this country can actually be a leading source of that. And I see that as a very, as a big reality. So I'll just conclude by saying that I hope you are taking care of each other, you're taking care of yourself during this very difficult time. And I want to thank everyone who's been on here, and also Dr. Ida Zilograndi for organizing this, which I think is a really nice series.
Thank you, Fabio Piano. You and all the speakers gave us enough food for thought for today. And finally, I want to thank our audience. See you next Tuesday, 29th, on Live Arts and Events, Irreplaceable. We will discuss the impossibility of replacing any work of art with a virtual copy, in as much as it lacks our contemporary presence in front of it. We will have with us Cristian Greco, Director of the Egyptian Museum in Turin, Bartolomeo Pietromarchi, Director of Maxi Arte Rome, art critic, Faisal Al-Hassan, Gallerist, General Manager of Warehouse 421 in Abu Dhabi, Umberto Fanni, General Director of the Royal Opera House in Muscat, and then finally a real legend, Nasir Shamma, musician, Director of the Bait Al Oud in Abu Dhabi. See you soon then.